Well, Doug, thank you for the very nice introduction. And thank you all for sticking around for the last session. I realize that we are standing in between you and the bar, so I'll do my best to keep these remarks brief. First off, thanks again for attending, and thank you to the organizers for bringing me in to speak. All right, just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. The diagnostics industry is a large one, $39 billion, with fairly modest growth in the mid-single digits. And we've highlighted a couple of things to talk about today. First off, the current challenges and risks, opportunities. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the state of financing. As Doug alluded to, it has been a fairly active M&A space within MedTech. So first off, just a word on diagnostics. I did mention this $39 billion market. As you might imagine, we are seeing some regional differences. Europe, for example, over the past couple of years, given the challenges over there, has had some slower growth. We've seen a little bit of that in the U.S. as well, somewhat as a result of the Great Recession, with overall lower employment and hence fewer people with health care insurance. Not surprisingly, the growth for the industry is in many ways coming from a lot of the emerging market countries, which has posted pretty much solid double-digit growth here for quite some time. And in the second half of the slide, as you can see, we've broken down the space into the various and sundry subsectors. And as you can see, there's a really dichotomy going on here within this space. You have some segments that are growing in the upper teens, like genetics. That's the personalized medicine part of this market. In other cases, you have other more mature subsegments, such as traditional blood testing for blood banking, for example. That's growing in the low single digits. A word on molecular diagnostics. This is collectively the fastest growing group within the space, and not surprisingly has attracted a fair amount of investor attention. And this too slowed down recently in 2010 and 2011, although we did start to see a little bit of a rebound at the end of 11, in part because of ongoing shifting of testing modalities from some of the older technologies into molecular. And in fact, we're even starting to see some improvements in overall utilization, both in the U.S., really at the end of 2011, and that's carried over into the beginning of 2012. We've also seen a few things going on in Europe around HAIs. It's also continued to see a little bit of an uplift in the infectious disease side of this market. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention automation. That has been a fairly strong recurring theme really across the space, and certainly in molecular is no exception. So let's focus a little bit on some of the current challenges and risks within the space. First off, on regulation. This, a few years ago, was a pretty significant issue for the group. The FDA was making some noise around stepping into the CLIA labs and regulating them. And just as a quick background, obviously everyone here in the audience understands that FDA is a regulatory body for manufacturers. However, within diagnostics, it's a bit unique as the labs are actually regulated by a division of HHS. They're under CLIA. They go through an annual inspection. They can self-validate tests. They do not officially have to go through FDA approval. Up until really the midterm elections, FDA was really rattling the saber on potentially stepping into this group. Since then, we've seen and heard very little. And so in general, the overall regulatory side of this space, I think, has backed off a little bit. A couple of other things to talk about here: CLIA and CLIA waiver status. Historically, this was a fairly opaque process. It took quite a while. I don't know that the timelines have improved so much, but FDA has generally given a little bit more clarity around the actual process itself. And then lastly, diagnostics is undergoing delays from FDA, like just about everything else in medical devices, although I would point out that under some of the personalized medicine tests, we have noticed that there does appear to be a willingness by FDA to have a relatively rapid turnaround time. I'd say the biggest challenge facing the market right now is the second bullet point there, reimbursement. And this comes in the form of a couple of different items, but in particular code stacking. or I should say the end of code stacking, has been something that's certainly been catching a lot of attention as of late. As a background, there's also a couple of different ways to pursue the reimbursement process within diagnostics. You can certainly go through the traditional CPT code pathway. On the other hand, because of the relatively rapid pace of innovation, we also have a series of miscellaneous codes that can be stacked together in order to form a single reimbursement amount. Now, the upside here is that if you operate a lab, this is a relatively fast way to establish reimbursement. On the other hand, from the payer's perspective, they're not getting as much detail into what they're paying for as they'd like. And so this came to a head here recently, and both the AMA as well as a combination of Palmetto and McKesson are seeking to, for all intents and purposes, unwind code stacking. AMA has actually rolled out 101 codes. We expect to see several hundred more. And these, of course, are moving towards trying to reduce some of the opaqueness of code stacking. On the other hand, Palmetto, who's the MAC for Jurisdiction 1, including California, has been working with McKesson, and in fact, they've released 2,000 codes that'll identify by the manufacturer and by the test, in addition to the stack. This actually went live on Monday, and we would expect that we may see some ramifications of this as soon as this June, so certainly something to keep an eye on. Additionally, within reimbursement, there is an ongoing debate, physician fee schedule versus lab fee schedule. I personally think this has probably been a little overblown in the space. There's some logistical issues that would have to happen in order to actually shift diagnostics onto the physician fee schedule, and we think it's unlikely to occur. Additionally, we are also, again, starting to see some outcomes-based performance in the form of effectively we will pay you if you do what you say you will do, essentially holding some of the labs and the manufacturers' feet to the fire. And in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if we see more of this in the future, but thus far it's been used relatively selectively. And then lastly, in the lab fee schedule, this 2013 is probably going to be a bit of an anomaly. There's some one-time things going on here, but we are going to see about a 5% average cut to reimbursement here in 13. Unlikely to happen in 14, but we're certainly keeping an eye on it. Outside of that, intellectual property, we've had a couple of pretty high-profile court cases recently. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously a couple of months ago for Mayo Reference Lab against Prometheus, and this certainly was of interest from a method of use standpoint, although I'd argue that the case was relatively narrowly defined and thus probably not going to be as negatively impactful, I think, as some were perhaps speculating initially. And then, of course, the ACLU and Myriad case, which has been remanded to the appeals court for reevaluation. Now onto the fun side. Opportunities. We consider that first line up there to be one of the biggest driving forces that we think will help shape the diagnostics industry going forward, and that is, and you've certainly seen this in a couple of different fashions here today, but the reality is that healthcare as a percentage of GDP has grown almost 50% in less than 20 years. And we believe that it is going to be difficult to continue to see this growth into perpetuity, and so you'll see a reallocation of healthcare spending, and that'll help benefit diagnostics. For every $50,000 therapy out there, for example, we think you can squeeze an awful lot of couple $1,000 diagnostics in to pay for that to help drive treatment selection to find the best patients for the therapy, and at the same time saving money for the overall system. And I would cite Genomic Health, who the data shows that they can indeed reduce chemotherapy usage by about 25% of the time in early stage breast cancer, and yet they collectively add about 15% to the total cost equation, netting the system about a 10% reduction. And this is at a $15,000 treatment too. So you can imagine, as we continue to move forward with some of these personalized medicine assays in development, I think this could be pretty transformational to the overall system. This, in turn, is helping to drive some of the innovation here and certainly the investments. When I got into this industry back in 2000 and started covering diagnostics in 2002, there's a lot less investor interest in the venture side than there is today, and I think that's in a large part because of some of the innovative technologies that have come out that have been turned to be used for some alternative purposes here. Sequencing, for example, comes to mind. This was historically just in the domain of research, and we're seeing this rapidly move into the clinic, driven by a couple of different systems, but those providers have indeed partnered then with other companies, some private, some public, to develop new and innovative diagnostics. And then lastly, again, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't mention some of the current and future utilization. I mentioned earlier that utilization has started to improve, and we're certainly rooting for it, and we are starting to see some positive effects of some of the job creation numbers as of late. But certainly long-term, given the demographic trends, we see a very significant role here for diagnostics in the future. And so that, of course, then takes us to the state of financing. And apparently I need to get a little bit better PowerPoint. That arrow should be over a little bit more. But this is actually a slide from one of my colleagues, Tom Gunderson, and it was kind enough to allow me to use this in the talk. It's one of my favorite slides. And on the left-hand side there, you see the growth rate of large med tech and how that has ratcheted down over the years. And at the same time, on the right-hand side, you see the growing cash balances. Now, what is this leading to? Well, I think it should be somewhat obvious here for the audience, but we've seen a resurgence, or an increase rather, in M&A within this space. Certainly as you look up and down that list, a lot of transactions in 2011, a lot of strategics coming in and buying smaller companies. As you can see, we've slowed down a little bit here in 2012. In fact, that second to the top transaction didn't happen. I should have edited that out. But the point here is I think some of the earlier reimbursement comments that I made around code stacking are probably making the market pause a little bit on M&A. I think that's temporary. As we get some of this sorted out over the next couple of months, wouldn't surprise us if this resumes. Just taking a look at some of the multiples here. A couple what I would point you to is looking at a trailing 12 months multiple of a little over 5 times, and a forward basis it's closer to 4 times, so very reasonable takeout multiples for the group. In terms of some of the premiums paid, and this is obviously on the public side of the world, about a 38% premium to the public valuations 1 month prior to the deal. I don't have the data in front of me, but my suspicion is that this probably is equivalent to, or perhaps rivals, some of the other subsegments of medical devices. So in conclusion, diagnostics is a very large and vibrant market. There certainly are some challenges, not unlike every industry, but I do think that some of the longer-term opportunities here far and away exceed the relatively near-term challenges. And certainly, not unlike any other subsegment, exits are obviously difficult. We have seen a nice resurgence in the IPO market as of late. I would expect to see M&A come back as well, and certainly we've had a couple of pretty active years there as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Doug and Jan. Thank you.
Yeah.